Okay, we've been talking about this phrase, loss and damage, and how countries that have been hit the hardest by climate change are the ones struggling the hardest to cover the cost of rebuilding. And they are insisting that the countries contributing the most greenhouse gas emissions be the ones to pay up. Now, look, we live in Canada, and as I mentioned, Canada is also experiencing the effects of climate change, right? Just take a look at Hurricane Fiona, which hit the Atlantic provinces in September, or the storm that left so many people in Ottawa without power for 2 weeks back in May, or the floods that hit BC last year, or the heat dome that hit BC a few months before the flood. Like, you get the picture, right? And you might be looking at all of that and thinking, remind me why we have to pay for the impact of climate change on other countries, right? Like global responsibility be damned, we've got our own problems. But here's just one more thing to consider, because, because of how increasingly interconnected our world is becoming, at some point, the costs of those disasters halfway around the world are going to show up here anyway. And we know just the right person to explain why. Robert McClellan, he's a geography professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. And while we were talking, we found out that the questions that we wanted to ask, he's already answered them, and lots of others for his students on TikTok.
Robert McClellan here. It's that day each week when they send trucks around to all the houses in my neighborhood to collect the household waste. Robert McClellan here. Many of the environmental challenges that we face these days are attributable, at least in part, to consumption patterns of people who live in urban centers, like here in Toronto. Robert McClellan. People don't often give much thought to what happens when they flush their toilet. Robert McClellan here. I'm in Helsinki. Robert McClellan here. Robert McClellan here.
Okay. So back to our question that we think the professor can help us with, and that is, how would climate events in other parts of the world affect us here in Canada?
Robert McClellan here. Andrew Chang over at CBC's About That asked me if I could describe 3 ways in which the impacts of climate change in other countries would come to affect Canadians. I can think of many ways, from disruptions to global food systems that raise the price of groceries, to disruptions to global supply chains that affect the availability of consumer goods on Canadian marketplaces.
Okay, so Robert says a few things there, right? First of all, what does he mean when he says climate-caused disruptions to global food systems that raise grocery prices? Like, what is that? Well, we've seen a few of those recently, right? Extreme heat, little rainfall meant pasta prices shot through the roof, 40% in Canada. Drought in California also meant that lettuce prices through the roof. And that drought even led to a sriracha shortage. Like, you got to grow those little peppers, right? So it was so bad, one of the major producers even said to its customers, no hot sauce for you, for like 5 months. And then the other part of what Robert was saying, how climate disrupts global supply chains. I mean, he's basically just describing a domino effect there. And I'll give you an example. Pakistan is the world's 5th largest producer of cotton, and half of its cotton crops wiped out in the flood. But just stop to think about what effect that has on all of those businesses that spin cotton into thread, or that weave the thread into fabric, or that turn the fabric into like your favorite t-shirt or socks or underwear or bed sheets or whatever. The point is that every kink in the chain can cause all kinds of problems and throw everything out of whack. And increasingly, climate is to blame for that. Okay, I'll throw things back to Robert. He'll finish up what he's doing. He'll throw us to commercial, and then we'll be back with a final thought.
But I want to focus on 3 human impacts of climate change that are going to become more pressing. First thing is that around the world right now, each year, on average, over 20 million people are displaced from their homes because of extreme weather events. So floods and storms and droughts and wildfires. And the frequency and severity of those events is going to increase as global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, as temperatures continue to rise, as sea levels rise. Remember that 10% of the global population lives in coastal areas. So there's going to be more people on the move in a climate-disrupted world. Most of them will move within their home countries and regions, but there will be growing demand for opportunities to move internationally to places like Canada. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We want more immigrants to come to Canada, but we want them to come because they want to be here, not because they've been displaced from their homes because of climate change. Second thing is that Canada is already a very globally globally connected society. So if you think about where people have moved to Canada in large numbers in recent years, from the Philippines, from China, from India, Pakistan, parts of Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, the United States, these are all areas that are highly exposed to the impacts of climate change. And so when there are disasters in those countries, we experience it through our networks of families and friends and loved ones in those countries. We want to do more to help them. We remit money, but often it feels inadequate. We feel stress, we feel anxiety, especially Canadians who've arrived relatively recently from those countries, because they often have stronger ties and there's greater pressure on them to remit money home, even at a time when they're only finding their financial footing here in Canada. Third thing is that there's countries where there's persistent conflict and violence and civil strife. Think about Somalia, for example, in East Africa. Right now there's a severe drought, there's a famine, which just magnifies the humanitarian impacts and makes it more challenging for humanitarian organizations, including those based in Canada, to provide assistance. If we think of West Africa, in Mali, for example, not only is there conflict and drought, but there are Canadian peacekeepers there right now who are in harm's way. So those are just 3 ways in which Canadians are going to be greatly exposed to the impacts of climate change in other parts of the world, and 3 reasons more why we should be doing our best to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and do our fair share to combat climate change.